Have you ever been in the dark? I mean, physically, totally dark. Everything around you, nothing you can see. I know it's not completely dark in here, but it's pretty close. It's a weird situation when you can't see anything entirely. Or maybe you're in more of a state of mental darkness where you don't understand something, and then eventually the light comes on. And it might even blind you, it shocks you, it surprises you because it was so unexpected and so different from what you were used to. Maybe there's a situation where there was something that you didn't know that blew your mind. I had one just this week. When I was a kid, I loved these little Kool-Aid bursts, they call them, right? That are a great summer beverage for kids. But the frustration is once you pop the top off and take a drink, you can't close it again. It's not like a bottle of soda or a can of anything. But guess what? I found this out on Twitter this week, that supposedly you can actually take the cap and put it in upside down, but it actually doesn't work. So Twitter let me down. But you know what I did finally realize? That this isn't anything special. It's not some fancy drink. It's literally just Kool-Aid. This cost me about $2 at the store, okay? And there's only 6 of them in here. As a kid, I had no idea about that, but I never understood why my parents wouldn't buy me these. I then realized that they just bought the powdered Kool-Aid because they can make pitchers worth of it instead of just buying 6 individually wrapped ones. I could have had way more Kool-Aid. And yeah, I just figured that out this week. Call me stupid, call me ignorant, I don't know. But in a lot of ways, my understanding of Kool-Aid is kind of like the European understanding of education and just the world in general during the Middle Ages. You could say they were dark. They didn't have much of an understanding. They were kind of dumb, not gonna lie, and there were a lot of reasons for that we've unpacked in the past. But today, we're gonna talk about how Europe, or at least part of it, finally got smart. Kind of. As we've discussed, Europe was culturally and educationally dark from the end of the Roman Empire all the way up until about the 1200s or so. What came next was a period of time which historians call the Renaissance. The word Renaissance means a rebirth or awakening. In this case, we're talking about a return to the way things were in the Greek and Roman times, a return to classical education and governing styles. And this will happen in Italy starting about the 1300s. The Renaissance will change the world forever, specifically changing individual worldviews. But before we talk about what actually changed, let's talk about why it happened in Italy first. First, we need to understand that towards the end of the 1300s was that time of crisis that we discussed in Europe. Within the 1300s and the 1400s, you see the end of the Crusades, the emergence of the Black Death, the fall of Constantinople, a greater distrust in the church, and a series of other economic issues that caused change to happen. And this was especially true in Italy. Italy will be the home of the Renaissance. It's where it all begins. And there's several factors as to why. The first has to do with its location. This is something we talked about during the height of the Roman Empire. Because Italy is right in the middle of Europe and the Mediterranean Sea, it is an excellent location for trade and crossroads. So lots comes in and lots goes out. Most specifically after the Crusades, so much came in from the Eastern world that changed the way Italians looked at life. They were now more ahead of the rest of Europe because they sort of embraced some of the Middle Eastern cultures that the rest of Europe had been shut off from. This system of exchange would only help Italy continue to flourish while the rest of Europe suffered in the midst of the Black Death and other crises. Italy was also home to this return to Roman and Greek culture because it was the home of it. That's right, remember, Rome was centered in Italy, and that city still existed, and the Catholic Church had preserved much of Roman culture. While it didn't necessarily spread throughout Europe, it was still there. There were still remains of Rome, including the columns of the old Roman Forum and some of the other buildings that had been built there. Latin language had survived as well. Everything echoed back to Rome. So that certainly allows this rebirth to occur. Now, you might also remember that I alluded to an important event happening in 1204 towards the end of the Crusade, specifically the Fourth Crusade, and that's the sack of Constantinople. This was led by Venetian merchants, Italians, and when they sacked Constantinople, they brought with them many of the old records and books from Constantinople and therefore from the Roman Empire. So in many ways, the Greek style, specifically of education, was rediscovered and brought back to Italy. And as these things were read, they quickly became a part of Italian culture. Now on top of that, Italy will be the home of a massive storehouse of Byzantine gold and other treasure. In fact, St. Mark's Basilica is famous for housing many different pieces of Byzantine memorabilia, including those 4 horses you see up top there. Those were supposedly on the gates of Constantinople themselves. Unlike the rest of Europe, Italy also wasn't swallowed up in feudalism. In fact, they had a different governing system. It echoes back to ancient Greece, but they had city-states. Cities like Milan, Florence, Rome, and Venice, and many others actually governed themselves. And because of this localized version of government, city-states remained relatively secluded from each other, much like ancient Greece. This allowed for many of these cities to be relatively unaffected by things like the Black Death, and definitely unaffected from feudal warfare. This allowed these cities to thrive and not have to focus on defending themselves or protecting their interests. Rather, they could grow their business. And that goes right into the fifth and final point as to why the Renaissance happened. The city-states of Italy were not reliant on agriculture like the rest of Europe was at this time because they were smaller. They didn't need as much food. This allowed people to find other jobs. So cities like Milan and Florence became manufacturing centers, things like textiles and other important goods that people with wealth could buy. Although none of this happens without the Black Death. The Black Death destroyed the economy and also destroyed the way people worked. People just weren't farmers anymore. You could do that, but that wasn't the way to survive anymore. Thanks to the Black Death, the economic system changes. That's going to lead to a change in the social structure of Italy. Merchants and the middle class began to emerge and became very wealthy and very powerful. This meant that there was money being circulated more in Italy than anywhere else. It's good for the economy, and it's pretty simple. When people buy stuff, the economy is better. And I suppose that's where the story of the Renaissance truly begins. Again, a rebirth or a return to Greek and Roman styles. Whether it's art, education, or life in general, we have a throwback to these ancient times, and it truly starts with these powerful merchant classes, specifically in the city of Florence, Italy. Merchant families quickly became powerful because of the spread of wealth. What really was our first true capitalist system in the world changed the world forever. And there were different families that grew in power, most notably the Medici family of Florence, who took power in about the 1400s. They were able to use their wealth and influence to really run the city as sort of governors. An example of this is sort of the patriarch of the Medici family, Cosimo de' Medici, who in 1434 or so was able to fully seize control of the Florentine government and run it as like a family business. Florence quickly became the center of not only wealth, but just culture, and Italian Renaissance culture. This continued under the grandson of Cosimo, Lorenzo de' Medici, probably the most famous Medici, who throughout his life was considered to be a patron of the arts. A great focus of Renaissance was the creation and production of massive new works of art. And we'll talk about what was different about those, but for now, know that families like the Medicis used their wealth to pay for new buildings and new works of art. We call them patron. The Medicis were influential in everything. They even had people involved in the church. Eventually, a family member of the Medici actually becomes Pope. And it's families like this that have the wealth necessary to fuel this rebirth. Without the wealth, without the change in economic status, the change away from feudalism, this Renaissance never would have happened. So with all that in mind, let's talk about what the Renaissance actually was. It wasn't just like an instant, boom, all of a sudden Europe is smart. Wouldn't that be nice if it was? It's not like just flipping on a light. It was very gradual. We're talking about a period between about 1300 all the way through 1500. But for the reasons we just talked about in Italy, there is a return to the old styles of Greece and Rome. It will, in essence, make Italy a little bit smarter than the rest of Europe. This is all connected back to something we've discussed all year, worldview. The way that you react to the things and experiences around you, the way that you understand the world history and everything else that goes into it. See, for the longest time in the Middle Ages, people's worldviews were picked for them. Right? The church and the penitential cycle created that, but we know that that's a flawed worldview because they left some things out. The Renaissance sparked a new belief in discovery for oneself, a personalization of that worldview. They have a fancy term for that. It's called humanism, and it was started by this guy, Francisco Petrarch. Petrarch was the father of humanism, and he believed in a return to classical studies. So going back and studying history, math, literature, rhetoric, all the basic things that we actually kind of take for granted today. More importantly, humanism stressed the importance of the individual. Not in an arrogant, narcissistic type of way, at least not yet, but more so in a way that glorified God. That God had created humans as chiefs among all other beings, his perfect creation in his own image. And because of that, we have this incredible ability to think and to reason and to create. That's what the Renaissance is. A focus on the gifts that each human has, and to share those gifts with the world. The Renaissance is an unprecedented time of human creativity, and the results, They kind of speak for themselves. Overall, we do see Europe's first true education movement outside of the church, a return to what we now call the humanities, Greek and Latin studies. And education was now accessible for more people, and it was starting to become part of the norm, especially to be educated for specific jobs. That's a major change. Work as we know it is disappearing. It's no longer based on serfdom and being bound to farmland. There's some choice and some freedom, the same thing that humanism emphasizes, available for every single person. It also sparks this curiosity. It also sparks the idea of individual understanding and learning. And how are you able to do that? Well, pretty simple. You have to be able to read. And so literacy rates will start to go up in Italy, and people will begin reading for themselves. Books will become a form of entertainment or a form of knowledge. Maybe the most famous example of this is one of the most early books from the Renaissance. It's called The Prince. It's by an author named Niccolo Machiavelli. Being a king for dummies, you could call it. The Prince was all about how a ruler should act with power. And Machiavelli believed very clearly that the end justifies the means, something we'll refer to a lot through this year. It's a dangerous ideology, but it's a new one. It basically states it doesn't matter how you get there as long as you get there. It doesn't matter what you did to get the end result as long as the end result is good. Well, as you can imagine, that's a little bit of a moral quandary, but we'll get into that later. He also tackles the question of, is it better for a ruler to be feared by his people or loved by his people? And kind of issues the case for both sides, but definitely leans towards fear is always better. For me, when it comes to the students that I lead / rule, however you want to call it, would I rather be feared and loved? Easy. Both. I want them to fear how much they love me. Mark that one down. Machiavelli set up a framework for leaders that would be followed for so much of modern history. This idea of having to do evil in order to create good. To have your people fear you a little bit so that you have control. It'll be copied time and again. The key here is that people like Machiavelli could produce that work for many people. Maybe the clearest place where we see a shift in worldview is within art and architecture themselves. Therein lies a literal, true beauty and representation of the Italian Renaissance itself. Let's look first at architecture. The buildings of the Middle Ages were honestly kind of boring. They were dark and gloomy in that Gothic old church style. Lots of stone, not a lot of color, not a lot of designs that make them pop. But during the Renaissance, this time that encouraged creativity and accessing human ability, we return back to the Roman styles. So the idea of using intricate columns to support buildings rather than just stone walls becomes more popular again. And the use of massive domes like this one, Il Duomo, which is Italian for the dome, pop up all over Italy, echoing back to the time of the Hagia Sophia and other great churches of the Greek and Roman world. Now, many of these buildings were churches, because in some ways there's a revitalization of faith and a beautification of these old Gothic churches and a creation of new ones. The best example remains St. Peter's Basilica, the church of the Pope essentially in Rome itself. So the Greek and Roman style, especially in columns and domes, is very evident in Italy as a result of the Renaissance. But art itself might be an even better indicator because we see a very stark change from the art of the Middle Ages to the art of the Renaissance. Take, for example, this picture here from the Middle Ages. Do you have any idea what's going on there? I sure don't. It's not easy to see. It looks like some kid drew it. That's actually supposed to be the Battle of Hastings. Kind of an important event. Compare that with this. Look how vividly this one is drawn. There's detail. It looks realistic. You can see light and shadow. You can see detail on the people in the picture, in the buildings themselves. There's depth. There is a perspective. That's what's different about Renaissance art. The perspective, looking at things in a realistic way. Perspective shows things as they are. Realism shows them how they look in real life. Putting those two things together gives you the most accurate and realistic paintings with intense details that we've ever seen. Renaissance art often depicted real-life events. Like these massive portraits that a patron would have paid for so that he could show himself to the world and preserve himself historically. You have more on this guy in like 3 videos, we'll get there. Or it would take more mythological events or biblical events, as so much of this art was produced for churches, and just puts them in Greek and Roman or Italian backgrounds. To take the events of the past and put them in more of a modern day sense. There's 3 people that really emphasize this and show this to us. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. Not the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I'm talking about the artists. This is the big three, the LeBron, Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh of Renaissance artists. And while I don't have time to go through everything each one of them painted or did, I'm going to try to give you the highlights so that you have some basic knowledge of the importance of these Renaissance artists. The first one is probably the most famous, Leonardo da Vinci, also known as the Renaissance Man, a guy of many talents who really reached a new level of human creation during this time. He's famous for the Mona Lisa, of course, but he's also famous for this, the Last Supper. It's one of the best examples of a religious painting, and just notice the detail again that we see here, as well as the fact that they're dressed in the Greek and Roman fashion. Da Vinci also vividly studied the human body to figure out how it worked. He also was an inventor, inventing things like supposedly a helicopter before it was actually ever created. This guy showed what it meant to be educated and to discover for oneself. He set the tone for so much of the Renaissance. Michelangelo also did this. He's a famous sculptor. You're probably most familiar with his David, but I can't show that for obvious reasons. His very vivid statue of Moses is also famous too. But the crazy thing was, Michelangelo, who was a sculptor, painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Yeah, that entire ceiling he painted by himself, never having painted anything before, and showcased so much of the Bible in stunning detail, like this picture of God creating Adam. It's one of the most famous pictures of Renaissance art. And then there's Raphael. Raphael was famous for a number of different depictions of Mary and Jesus, or what they called the Madonna and Child. But he also painted this, the School of Athens. Here we see a literal throwback to ancient Greece. The picture shows a meeting of a number of famous Greek philosophers together, engaging in discourse and rhetoric. And almost everything here is Greek and Roman, except for the fact that he threw himself in there, along with Da Vinci and Michelangelo. Here we see this uniting of the Renaissance styles and the people of the Renaissance with ancient Rome and ancient Greece, the connection across time periods. The rebirth is happening. And with it comes a new understanding of education, and more importantly, human discovery and worldview. That is the power of the Renaissance. That's why it's so important in Italy. And yes, Italy will be ahead of the rest of Europe because of that. Now, it's not as simple as just turning on a light switch. It wasn't instant. But this period of time will change the world. People are beginning to think for themselves, to discover for themselves, to see what they can do. Now, obviously, this is going to have effects. Because as people discover, they're also going to question. They're going to question systems that have been in place for hundreds of years. They're going to question old worldviews, old understandings, old things that were considered to be normal. And with that, some good may come. Maybe we can get rid of some old systems, some ones that were not only dated, but wrong. But notice the freedom that's here. Discovery is great. Accessing your creativity and doing whatever you're capable of because you're a human and because you're created by God, that's awesome. There's a power to that. But I quote the great Uncle Ben in Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. What are you going to do with that gift? What are you going to do with what God has given you the ability to do, to reason, to think, to create? How will you use that? At the start of the Renaissance, this seems like a good thing, and it will continue to be good. But there's danger here. The world is changing very quickly, and it's very unexpected. How else will it continue to change? Well, that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.